Episode 14, Family Conflict. It's not about the money. Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fellen, and this is the Next Gen Mentor podcast. This series is for you if you've grown up with family wealth always there in the background, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and often not spoken about directly. Now that wealth is becoming something that you will soon have to relate to, and I'm here to help you prepare to do that. Last time we spoke about how to work with advisors, what they actually do, how their incentives shape their perspective, and how to stay engaged without becoming reactive or dependent. Now we move yet another step further. You see, once you begin to engage with advisors, with decisions, and with the system around you, something else becomes visible, something that is often misunderstood, and that is family conflict, and more specifically, what sits underneath it. Most people, when they look at conflict in families like yours, assume it's about the money, about who gets what, about fairness, about control of assets. But in reality, that is rarely what is actually happening. Money is simply the surface, the visible part, the language through which something is being expressed. Underneath it almost always sit three things: control, identity, and fear. And unless you understand that, you will misread almost every single conflict that you encounter. So let me start with something simple. You may remember from our earlier sessions, particularly the third, where we spoke about systems, that you are part of something that is not just a collection of assets. It's a structure, a set of relationships, a history. Now, imagine that structure over time with different people, different roles, different levels of involvement, different expectations, and no single moment where all of that is clearly explained. What you get instead is something perhaps more subtle. People interacting within a system that they only partially understand, each carrying their own interpretation of what's fair, what's expected, and what's theirs. And because those interpretations are rarely made explicit, they naturally begin to diverge, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, until eventually something happens. Let me start with something simple. You may remember from our earlier sessions, particularly the third, where we spoke about systems, that what you are part of is not just a collection of assets, it's a structure, a set of relationships, a history. Now imagine that structure over time. Different people, different roles, different levels of involvement, different expectations, and no single moment where all of that is clearly explained. What you get instead is something else. People interacting within a system that they only partially understand, each carrying their own interpretation of what is fair, what is expected, what is theirs, and because those interpretations are rarely made explicit, they begin to diverge, almost imperceptibly at first, until eventually something happens. A decision, a change, a transition, and suddenly what looks stable begins to feel tense because of what it represents. In session 10, we concluded that governance is not just about decisions. It's about how relationships are protected. And when governance is unclear, something rather predictable happens. Decisions that should remain structural now become personal. A distribution is no longer just a distribution. It becomes a statement about fairness. A role is no longer just a role. It becomes a statement about recognition. An exclusion is no longer just practical. It becomes a statement about trust.
How does control play a role?
Control is rarely discussed openly in families. It tends to sit beneath the surface. Who actually decides, who influences decisions, who is included, who is not? You'll recognize this from session 8, where we discussed how decisions are really made. Influence is not evenly distributed. It rarely sits where it appears to sit. Now consider What happens when that is not fully acknowledged? Someone may feel that they should have a voice but do not. Another may feel that they are responsible but not trusted. A third may feel that they are being carried by decisions they did not shape. None of this is about money, it's about position. And when position is unclear, control becomes the proxy. People begin to argue about outcomes, but what they're really responding to is their place within the system.
And identity?
Identity is, in many ways, a lot more personal. Remember from our earlier sessions that one of the most important challenges that you face is defining who you are within the system that you have inherited. Now extend that across an entire family. Each person is trying, consciously or not, to answer the very same question. Who am I in this? Am I the one who leads, the one who protects, the one who builds, the one who questions? Or am I simply someone who receives? These questions are rarely asked directly, but they sit behind behavior. And when identity is unclear, people look for signals: recognition, inclusion, responsibility. And when those signals do not align with how someone sees themselves, tension begins to build. Again, not because of the money, but because of what it implies.
Can you give me an example?
Okay, here's one. Imagine two siblings. One is deeply involved in the family business. The other has built a life elsewhere. Now, on paper, a distribution is made equally. From the outside, that looks fair, balanced, logical, but from the inside, it may feel very different. The one involved in the business may feel that their contribution is just not recognized. The one outside may feel that their independence is being judged. The same decisions, two completely different interpretations. And the tension that follows is not about the numbers, it's about identity.
What about the third layer you have mentioned, fear?
That all important third layer, fear. This is the one that's least visible. Fear rarely presents itself directly. It appears as caution, as resistance, as hesitation. But underneath it, something else is usually present: fear of losing influence, fear of being excluded, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of damaging relationships. In session 8, we saw that risk is behavioral. It's about how you respond to uncertainty. Conflict operates in a very similar way. It's not just about what's happening. It's about how people experience what's happening. And when uncertainty increases, fear tends to follow. So now when you combine those three elements, those three layers, something quite predictable happens. Control becomes contested, identity becomes sensitive, and fear becomes present. And money becomes simply the language through which all of this is expressed. Why? Because money is measurable, it's visible, it can be discussed without saying what actually needs to be said. So instead of saying, I don't feel heard, the conversation becomes, this decision isn't fair. Instead of saying, I'm not sure what my role is, it becomes, why is this structured this way? Instead of saying, I'm worried about losing influence, it becomes, we should reconsider this allocation. And unless you see what sits underneath, you will respond to the surface, which rarely resolves anything.
How does conflict actually start?
Conflict in families rarely begins as open conflict. It begins as a kind of misalignment. Remember from the discussion on how families lose everything slowly, that misalignment, like so many things, builds gradually. Different interpretations of what is fair, what is appropriate, what is expected. And because those interpretations are not addressed early, they accumulate. Small differences, small tensions, small assumptions, until eventually they reach a boiling point where they can no longer remain implicit, and when they surface, they often do so explosively. Even though the process has been building for years, this is why conflict often feels disproportionate. A relatively small decision can be the straw that breaks a camel's back. It can be something that triggers a very strong reaction, not because of the decision itself, but because it connects to something that has been building for a long time, unspoken, unresolved, and unclear.
What should I do when I witness it? What can I do?
At this stage, your role is definitely not to resolve conflict. Your role is just to begin to see it properly, to recognize that when tension appears, the question is not simply what is being argued, but rather what is actually at stake here. Is this about control? Is this about identity? Is this about fear? Or is it a combination of all three? Once you begin to see that, your position can change. You're no longer reacting to the surface. You're beginning to understand the structure beneath it. And this connects directly back to something we discussed throughout the series: awareness. You saw it in understanding systems, you saw it in decision making, you saw it in working with advisors, and you will see it here as well. Without awareness, even well intentioned actions can make things far worse. Trying to fix a disagreement about money without understanding what sits beneath it often intensifies it. Addressing the surface without recognizing the structure simply moves the tension somewhere else. So for now, stay with the observation. Notice where tension appears. Notice how it is expressed. Notice what is said. And just as importantly, what is not said. In family systems like yours, what's not said often carries far more weight than what is. And that is where real understanding begins. Once you begin to see conflict in that way, something changes rather quickly. It becomes less surprising, less confusing, and importantly, less personal. One of the most difficult aspects of family conflict at your stage is how easily it can feel directed at you. You may find yourself thinking that a reaction is about something that you said, or something that you did, or something you failed to do. And sometimes that may be true, but often it's not. It's just the system expressing something through the moment that you happen to be part of.
Can you explain that a little more?
Okay, let's take a step back. We agreed that you're entering a structure that has existed long before you, a structure that carries history, decisions, moments of agreement, moments of tension. Some of those moments were resolved, but many were not. And unresolved elements don't just disappear, they remain, under the surface maybe, but nevertheless influencing behavior, shaping reactions, altering how people interpret what is happening now. We saw this already when we spoke about how systems evolve. Patterns form, and those patterns continue long after the original situation has passed. Conflict follows exactly the same logic. What you're seeing in the present often has deep roots in the past, but those roots are not always visible. So when you enter into a tense discussion today, you may feel that you're dealing with the issue at hand, but in reality, you're often dealing with multiple layers at once: the immediate decision and the accumulated history that sits behind it. And this is why reactions can feel disproportionate, because they're not only responding to the present, they're responding to a pattern. Now, at this stage, there is a temptation to try and simplify things, to reduce the situation to something logical, to say, this is the issue and this is the solution. But in family systems, that approach rarely works on its own, because logic doesn't operate in isolation. It operates within relationships, and relationships carry memory. In session 5, we looked at the fact that respect is built through behavior consistently over time. Sadly, the same thing applies in reverse. Tension also builds through behavior consistently over time. Small moments, small misunderstandings, small assumptions, repeated over time. And just as respect compounds, so does tension until something brings it to the surface.
Does everyone respond to conflict in the same way? I assume not.
You're absolutely right. Not everyone responds in the same way. Some move towards conflict, some move away from it, some try to control it, some try to avoid it entirely. These responses are rarely random. They tend to follow patterns, often shaped by personality and character, but also shaped by experience. Someone who has seen conflict and how it can damage relationships may avoid it at all costs. Someone who has learned that influence comes from assertion may lean into it. Someone who feels uncertain about their position may become even more cautious. Someone who feels that their position is under threat may become more forceful. Again, none of this is about money. It's about how individuals relate to uncertainty, to position, and to each other. This is where something subtle can begin to matter. How you position yourself within conflict, not to resolve it immediately, but to understand how you engage with it. Your instinctive reaction will shape how others experience you, and over time that can become part of your identity within the system. There are two common instincts at your stage. The first is to step back, to avoid saying too much, to avoid taking a position, to avoid being drawn into the tension. It feels safe, and in the short term, it often is. But over time, it does create distance. You become present but not engaged. And as we discussed earlier, presence without contribution eventually limits influence. The second instinct is to try and resolve things quickly, to bring clarity, to find a solution, to move past the tension. It can feel productive, but it also carries a different risk. Because if you move too quickly to resolution without understanding what sits beneath, you may be addressing the surface, but you're not addressing the structure. And when that happens, the issue tends to return, sometimes in a different form, sometimes with greater intensity. So again, the pattern repeats: observation before action, understanding before intervention.
Are there specific moments that I should watch out for when conflict tends to arise?
Conflict tends to center around moments of transition, a change in responsibility, a shift in control, a decision that alters direction. These moments do matter because they affect position, and when position changes, identity and control are both brought into question. Think back to what we discussed in session 11 about how families can lose everything slowly. One of the patterns in that session was misalignment, different interpretations building over time until they begin to affect decisions. And now imagine that misalignment meeting a moment of transition. The effect is rarely neutral. It tends to bring underlying differences into focus, sometimes quite abruptly. For example, a generational transition, responsibility moving from one generation to the next. Now, on paper, this may look structured, planned, logical, but in practice, it touches on something a lot deeper: control shifting, identity evolving, fear increasing. The outgoing generation may feel a loss of influence. The incoming generation may feel uncertainty about expectations. Both may feel that something important is at stake, and again, the conversation may appear to be about structure, but what is actually being experienced is something else entirely. This is why conflict is most often visible at points where something changes, because it reveals what was already there.
What about when things are left completely unsaid?
There is something very important that you need to understand about silence. Silence in family systems is rarely neutral. You may see situations where people do not express disagreement, where decisions appear to be accepted, where conversations remain smooth. And it may be tempting to interpret that as alignment. But as we discussed when looking at decision making, agreement does not always mean alignment. Sometimes it simply means that people have chosen not to engage. And that choice can come from many places: uncertainty, fatigue, a desire to avoid tension, or a belief that their input will not change the outcome, or even a desire to get to lunch. Over time, this kind of silence creates its own form of tension. What is not expressed does not disappear, it accumulates until it finds a way to surface, often at a later stage, and often in a way that feels disconnected from the original issue. So when you encounter conflict, it's useful to look not only at what is being said, but also at where silence has been present before. It's silence that often tells you where something has been left unresolved.
Does fairness play a part in all this?
Fairness is one of the most commonly invoked ideas in family conflict, but it's also one of the least clearly defined. Because fairness is not objective, it is interpreted, and different people interpret it differently based on their role, their contribution, their expectations. What feels fair to one person may feel entirely unfair to another, and unless those interpretations are understood, discussions about fairness can become circular, repeating the same points without actually moving forward. This connects back to identity again, because fairness is often tied to how someone sees their role within the system. If that role is unclear or feels misaligned, fairness becomes a way of expressing that misalignment. At this stage, as with everything else we've discussed, you're not expected to resolve those differences, but you do need to recognize them and to see that when fairness is being discussed, something deeper may be present: recognition, contribution, position. Now, there is one more extra layer that's worth understanding before we go any further, and that is the difference between visible conflict and underlying tension. Visible conflict is obvious: disagreement, raised voices, clear opposing views. It draws attention, it feels uncomfortable. But it also has one advantage: it's explicit. You can see it, you can engage with it. Underlying tension is different. It's more silent, less visible, but often more persistent. It shows up in subtle ways: a hesitation in conversation, a lack of engagement, a sense that something is not quite aligned. And because it's not openly expressed, it can remain in place for a long time, influencing behavior without being addressed. In many families, the real challenge is not visible conflict, it's underlying tension. Visible conflict, however uncomfortable, creates an opportunity to engage. Underlying tension does not. It sits in the background, shaping decisions indirectly. So part of your awareness needs to extend to both what is being openly discussed and what feels unresolved beneath the surface.
So conflict is inevitable. Is that right?
Let's put it this way: conflict is not an exception in family systems. It's a natural outcome of complexity. Different people, different roles, and different expectations, all interacting within a structure that is not always fully defined. Once you accept that, your relationship with conflict can begin to change. It becomes less something to avoid and more something to understand and observe. Within it, there is information about how the system actually works, about where alignment exists and where it does not, about what people value and what they are protecting. And that information over time becomes one of the most valuable things that you can develop. It allows you to navigate the system with a level of awareness that most people simply never quite reach, understanding what sits beneath it. Once you begin to see conflict as information rather than disruption, something else can become possible. You can start to anticipate it, not in the sense of predicting specific disagreements, but in recognizing the conditions under which tension is likely to emerge. There are certain situations where this happens more frequently, moments where decisions affect multiple people in different ways, moments where roles are unclear or evolving, moments where expectations have not been fully aligned. And perhaps most importantly, moments where something important is not being said. You may notice, for example, that discussions become more cautious, language becomes less precise, people refer to things indirectly rather than clearly. Questions are asked, but not fully pursued, and these small signals often indicate that something sits beneath the surface, something that has not yet been addressed.
How can I use my credibility to resolve conflict?
Credibility does begin to matter at this stage, not in the abstract sense, but in how others experience you within moments of tension. Remember session 5, where we saw that credibility is built through consistent behavior over time. Conflict is one of the situations where that credibility is tested most clearly by how you engage. Do you remain measured? Do you listen fully? Do you avoid reacting too quickly? Or do you become drawn into the dynamic without fully understanding it? People notice this and they form a view, whether you contribute to stability or whether you amplify tension. This doesn't mean that you avoid difficult conversations, but it does mean that you approach them differently. And this is where a shift begins to happen. You begin to see that conflict, when handled properly, can actually improve the system. When underlying tensions are brought into the open and understood clearly, something becomes possible that was not possible before. Alignment, a clearer understanding of where people stand, what matters to them, and what needs to be taken into account. This connects directly to session 10 about governance. Governance is not just about making decisions. It's about creating a framework where disagreement can exist without damaging relationships. And conflict, when engaged with properly, becomes part of that framework, but only when the underlying elements are recognized: control, identity, fear. If those remain unacknowledged, conflict tends to repeat in different forms across different situations. You may also begin to notice that certain individuals play particular roles in conflict. These roles are rarely assigned, but they do tend to emerge consistently. Understanding this is useful in order to recognize patterns, because once you see the pattern, you're less likely to be drawn into it unconsciously, and over time, this allows you to choose your position more deliberately and engage with awareness. Now, some key takeaways and actions. Things to do. Firstly, look beyond the surface issue to understand what is really at stake. Secondly, notice patterns of behavior, not just individual disagreements. Thirdly, stay present in difficult conversations without reacting too quickly. Fourthly, listen for what is not being said as much as what is said. Fifthly, build credibility through calm, consistent engagement. And here are some to avoid. Firstly, assuming conflict is only about money or fairness. Trying to resolve issues too quickly without understanding them. Thirdly, withdrawing from tension to avoid discomfort. Fourthly, taking reactions personally without context. And fifthly, ignoring small tensions that may build over time. Join me in the next session, our 15th, where we continue to focus on people and look at the key skill of influencing without power. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.